Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 65 for the 24th of Shevat in a leap year. And today we are going to be learning the entirety of chapter 24. So stick with it. But before we begin, I want to start off by giving over a fable that I happened to hear by Hashgacha Pratis very recently on some audiobook or podcast or something. I don't remember exactly where I heard it, but it's very telling, and it is very much in line of the theme of today. So the fable goes that one time there was a scorpion who asked a frog to carry him over a river. The frog hesitated and said, "I don't know if this is a good idea, because if I take you across the river, what's going to stop you from stinging me?" And the scorpion said, "Don't worry about that." He said, "If I were to sting you, then I would die, and then we'd both sink. So I don't want to drown. So, don't worry about that." And the frog says, "That's a really good point. Okay." And he says, "Sure. Okay, great. Come upon my back." So the scorpion goes onto the back of the frog, and they start swimming in the river, and everything's going great. Midway into the river, the scorpion stings the frog, and they start drowning. And as they're drowning, as they're about to die, the frog turns to the scorpion. He said, "Why did you do that?" And the scorpion says, "Alas, it is my nature." So why do I bring up this story? So the reason why I bring up this story is to illustrate the point that nature can be very cruel. Animals can behave very, very cruelly. There's a misconception, maybe promoted by Disney, I'm not sure, that, nature is really peaceful and beautiful. And if not for humanity, the humans are the ones that really come in and mess everything up. And if we were to just stay out of the way, everything would be glorious and amazing and everything. And the truth is that's not true. As we see, with this example with the scorpion, there are numerous other examples too of animals. Very many animals will kill for fun. Husky dogs are known to kill sheep for fun. Often there'll be like a farm of a bunch of dead sheep, and they were just killed by husky dogs. They weren't eaten. It wasn't for self-defense. It wasn't, for self-preservation or anything like that. It was just like raw killing for fun. A lot of animals will rape one another even. There are stories of ducks ganging up and raping hens. There are stories of chimps murdering. You often see cats toying and playing with mice, dragging them even after they died, just for fun. So the stories go on, and it really is quite horrific if you really think about it. But what we see from this story with the scorpion and the frog, that alas, this is their nature. This is the nature of animals. And when we say nature, people say, Mother Nature or whatever. As Jews, we believe, no, this is ultimately it's Hashem. Who created their nature is Hashem. Hashem, God, is the one in charge of their nature, but this is how he created them. So the reason why I'm talking about this and how it's relevant to today's theme is we see that as cruel as animals can be, and as horrific as nature can be, at the end of the day, these animals do not have freedom of will, and they're behaving exactly in line with the way that God created them for whatever purpose. We don't know what that purpose is always. Often, usually, we don't know what the purpose is, but Hashem has his reasons. And we've talked about elsewhere in the Tanya how everything in the world, what is created and is vitalized by God, and that for some reason or another, God actually did create certain things in the world that appears to be bad, that appears to be concealing him, that appears to be going against his will. So these are the types of things that would fall into that category. So now, where do humans come into this? And this is what the topic of today is really going to address, is that humans are unique in the sense, and especially Jews, because we were given a very specific purpose, that we are the one creation in the entire universe that was given something very special as a gift, which is freedom of will. So we have agency, we have self-control, we have the ability to choose our actions and decide what it is that we want to do, which is not something that animals can do. So thus, the ramification for this is that on the one hand, this is a really beautiful gift that God gave us, this gift of free will. On the other hand, it's a huge responsibility. And the ramification and the intensity of what this means, and this is what we're going to talk about in today's Tanya, is that means that when an animal behaves in a way that seems to go against the will of God, it's not really their fault. And it's like, we can't really put them fully to blame, because it's like, this was their nature. This is how Hashem created them. So what do you expect? However, if a person behaves in a way that is against the will of God, even in the smallest way, then not only is he degrading himself to the level of an animal, we can't even say that, because animals aren't degraded. Animals are just behaving the way that God created them. What he's actually doing is he's degrading himself way, way, way below the level of an animal, like really far below that, and far below any of the klipos, any of the negative forces that God created, because these forces, these klipos, the sitra achra, all these things that we talked about in previous episodes, and again, go back and listen to them if you need to review what that means. These were all created by God for a specific purpose, and again, they don't have their own will. So when a human behaves in a way that is against the will of God, he does have his free will. So when we do that, God forbid, we're actually degrading ourselves below these negative forces. So it's a pretty intense message. So, but it is something, to know about and to be aware of. And we're going to get more into it today in a more detailed way once we get into the chapter. So let's begin right away and see how the Alter Rebbe breaks it down for us. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that this, in contrast to this, it exists. So zelu matzeh is the Hebrew term for that. So what's he talking about is that up until now, in the last few episodes, we've been talking about the positive commandments and the effect of the positive commandments, and how our bodies become chariots for God when we perform God's positive commandments, which are the 248 positive commandments. Today, we're focusing on the transgressions, the mitzvahs lo taseh, the negative commandments. So these are the 365 negative commandments, the transgressions from the Torah, as well as all of the rabbinical prohibitions that are included within that, because these are all things that are against the will of God and are actually the polar opposite of the will of God. And they are totally separate from his unity and from his oneness, in total utmost separation. Just like the sitra achra and the klipa, which we talked about previously, which are called total idolatry and other gods, because they conceal God's will, supernal will, entirely. So just to pause here and give a little bit of a recap. So again, we talked about in the last few episodes, and please go back and review to be up to speed with that the 248 positive commandments, what those are they are the organs or limbs of God, depending on how you translate it. And what that ultimately means is they are expressions of God's will. They express what God wants to do. Just like when we act in certain ways, like if we walk into the kitchen and we take a glass of water, this is an expression of our will to take a glass of water. Our limbs are expressing our will. So God's limbs are expressing his will. What are God's limbs? The positive commandments. Now we're talking about the negative commandments, the transgressions. And we're talking about how these transgressions, these 365 prohibitions, are the opposite of God's will. They are an expression of what God does not want, what repulses God, what is exactly what he doesn't want. And they are in the same category of the other side, the sitra achra, the klipa, idolatry, and anything really that conceals God's will. All of these things somehow conceals God's will. And what else is included in this category are the three levushim, the three garments of the animal soul of the Jew. So that again, this animal soul of the Jew comes from klipas noga. So remember, klipas noga we talked about is there's the three impure klipas that are totally bad, and then there's klipas noga that can go either way. So that's where the animal soul of the Jew comes from. So, and this animal soul of the Jew has three garments. And what are those three garments again? It's thought, speech, and action, which become enclosed in the 365 negative commandments from the Torah or from the rabbinical prohibitions. And so too the animal soul itself, which is vested within these garments. They are all united with the sitra achra and the klipa, which is called actual idolatry. So again, just to kind of recap where we're up to so far, is we're basically saying that the 365 transgressions that are included in the Torah are an expression of what God does not want. They're an expression of things which conceal God. And so since these 365 prohibitions are an expression of concealment of God and what God does not want, which can also be termed sitra achra and klipa and idolatry, so too in this category do we find the animal soul as well as the garments of the animal soul, which perform these transgressions, the 365 transgressions. So it makes sense, right? Because it's like if somebody were to, break one of the commandments in the Torah, they use their body, they use the garments of the animal soul in order to do that. So then not only that, the Alter Rebbe goes on, but actually not only are they united with the sitra achra and the klipa, which is called idolatry, but they are actually nullified to it, and they are actually secondary to it, and they're actually worse than it. Why? Because the klipa is not vested in a physical body, and it knows its maker. It's not rebelling against its maker, but rather it's just doing its job, because God, as we mentioned, God is the one that created the klipos. And so this is its job, to go against God's will. That's what it was created for. So the klipos are not intentionally rebelling against God. They are just acting out in the way that God created them to be. And the Alter Rebbe here brings a proof from this with Bilam, who Bilam was a prophet in the Torah, who was hired. You can look up the full story of that, but he was hired by a king Balak to curse the Jews, and he wasn't able to do it. And it says in Bamidbar chapter 22, verse 18, Bilam explicitly said, Lo uchal la'avor et pi Hashem v'gomer. So he acknowledged that literally means I cannot go against the will of God. So Bilam was not a good person, but he wasn't acting out of his own agency. He was totally just a messenger for God. So even the klipos, which are referred to as being idolatry, even them, they can't totally renounce God. They say that God is the God of other gods. So it's like sort of like their mistake is that they say that there are other gods and not just God, but they're not able to totally renounce God, because they acknowledge the fact that their entire vitality and their entire existence that they get, even though it's coming from the hind parts of God, it's coming from the hind parts of the supernal will of God that is hovering above them, as we explained before. It's just that this life force that is within them is in a way of exile within them. And so the fact that God is found, this godly life force that is within them is within them in a way of exile, what this produces is it gives them the false sense that they have their own independent existence, and they think of themselves as being gods as well, which is obviously false. And this is actually, a heresy against his unity and oneness. But they don't totally go against God completely. They don't say that he doesn't exist. They just call him the God of the gods, meaning that they acknowledge the fact that their vitality comes down to them through God, and they don't actually go against the will of God. Because as we mentioned, God created them for a specific purpose, and they are fulfilling that particular purpose. But rather, when it comes to a man, if a person goes against the will of God, this person is actually way worse and lower than even the sitra achra and the klipa, which are called idolaters and other gods. So that's pretty intense, right? And this is because when a person goes against the will of God, this is the utmost separation from his unity and from his oneness of God. And in so doing, they're denying God's unity even more than these klipos are. And then the Alter Rebbe here cites something from a Kabbalist book called the Eitz Chaim, from Portal 42 at the end of chapter 4, in which it says that the evil that's found in this material physical world is like the sediments of the klipos that which are in the end of its purifying process. So it's like the lowest of the low place. So, and this is why, so basically what the point that he's bringing out here is that in this world that we're found in, it's like the lowest of the lowest of the lowest place. And this is why everything in this world is very coarse and harsh, and it seems like wicked people are prevailing here in this world. So what the Alter Rebbe is really trying to illustrate here is just like how low a person goes when they go against the will of God. And then he goes on to explain this, that not only is it like a low thing that a person does, but it's actually insane. It actually is totally outside of the realm of sanity when a person does something that's against the will of God. And he explains this by bringing a citation from the Gemara. And this is from Sota, page 3a. And this is, talking about the Sota, talking about the adulterous woman who, a woman that's married to a man and then she commits adultery with somebody else, where the Gemara says, "En adam avera chule ela im ken nichnas beruach shtut." So a person does not commit a transgression unless a spirit of folly enters into him. So this is this idea that basically the only reason why somebody would go against the will of God, it's such a nonsensical thing to do. It's such a lowly thing to do that like really is so beyond any kind of reason, that the only reason why somebody would actually go against the will of God is if a spirit of folly, of insanity enters into them. And the Alter Rebbe goes on and says, and this applies, specifically the example is given with an adulterous woman. And why? Because in the case of an adulterous woman, the Alter Rebbe says, so this is like we're picturing a woman who actually might have certain lustful thoughts and is kind of frivolous in her mind. And even she, the Gemara is telling us, she would have been able to control her taivas, to control her desires, if not for the spirit of folly that was entered into her. So no matter how lustful a person is feeling, how frivolous they are, they wouldn't do something that would be against the will of God in such a manner, because it's so beyond the realm of sanity and it's so evil that it's not something somebody would do unless a spirit of folly entered into them. And this spirit of folly, what does it do? It conceals and covers up the hidden love that is found in the godly soul of this woman. So if you remember from previous episodes, we talked about this, that every single Jew contains within them a hidden love, which gets aroused in times of intense situations where somebody is threatened, God forbid, with death, or bow down to an idol or to renounce their Judaism or whatever. And time again, the Alter Rebbe told us how a Jew will be willing to give up their life rather than to renounce God. And so the Alter Rebbe is saying here that for this woman, she too has this hidden love of God within her. And this hidden love of God would prevent her from bowing down to idols if she were in such a state where it was like her life or bow down to an idol. And even if it was a state of just bow down and you don't actually have to believe in it within your heart, she wouldn't bow down to an idol, is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. And so if you think about this, that she would be willing to give up her life in order to not bow down to an idol, but yet she's not able to control her adulterous instincts, to her desires to be with another man. Like, it seems a little bit strange. And so the reason for this, the Alter Rebbe says, is because of the spirit of folly that enters into her. It's not a rational thing, because overcoming this momentary pleasure, this lust, that she has to cheat on her husband. I mean, okay, that might seem like a difficult thing to do, and maybe even you can say painful, but is it as painful as death? I don't think anybody would argue that it's more painful than death. Death is obviously more painful, but yet she'd be willing to give up her life for God if she was put in a situation of having to worship idols versus dying. And so if that's the case, she'd be willing to suffer the pain of death, but she's not willing to suffer the pain of overcoming this temptation of adultery. So it seems really strange, right? And so the Alter Rebbe explains that this is because it's not something rational. This is just because of the spirit of folly that is the klipa that becomes enclosed within her godly soul until the chokhmah that is within her. But not, the Alter Rebbe is makes sure to point out, not including the faculty of chokhmah. So it reaches up until her faculty of chokhmah, and so that is what causes her to commit adultery, is this spirit of folly. So what this means is basically the spirit of folly brings about this like certain temporary insanity to the adulterous woman, where she doesn't realize what she's doing, that she's going against the will of God, and isn't willing to sacrifice this temporary pleasure, even though she'd be very willing to sacrifice a whole life of pleasure by giving up her life and dying in order to not worship idols. But the truth is, get away from the insanity, the Alter Rebbe is saying, and let's look at it rationally. In true truth, even a very, very small transgression, this is going against the supernal will of God. And going against the supernal will of God, this is the utmost separation from his unity and from his oneness, even more than the sitra achra and the klipos, which are called other gods, and actual idolatry. And so too, in regards to all of the things that come out of the sitra achra and klipa in this world, which, what are those things? These are like the impure animals and beasts and impure birds and all the different insect and reptiles and things like that. And then the Alter Rebbe here brings a very apt saying from the Gemara, or citation from the Gemara from Sanhedrin, page 38a, where it says, Yatush kadmach, which literally means that the gnat, or like a mosquito, preceded you. So the Gemara is saying here basically that it's pointing out the fact that that a gnat was created before a human. So a human should not think of themselves as too high. We shouldn't get too high and mighty on ourselves. We should remember that we actually were the last creatures that were created. And hopefully this will give us a little bit of humility. And what the Alter Rebbe is pointing out here is that we are not, sort of what I was talking about in the beginning of the podcast today, is we are not greater than the animals in a certain sense. And when we go against the will of God, we're actually making ourselves a lot lower than them. And the reason why the Alter Rebbe picks the example of a gnat is, what is it about a gnat? Is it doesn't excrete. So it takes in and it doesn't give out. And this is an example of the lowest type of klipa, and the one that is the furthest from holiness, because it's like just taking, and it's not giving. Because what is holiness? Holiness is all about giving, and holiness is all about giving to that which is very far from it even. And so this gnat, which is like, the epitome of unholiness, that it just takes and doesn't give, this gnat is considered to be higher than, or it precedes the man who sins in the hishtalshalos, in like the descent of the vitality of the world from the supernal will of God. And this is true also for all the other impure animals, and even like the really bad and wild beasts. So, maybe in that category would fall some of the animals which I talked about in the beginning of this episode, which act in really, wild and horrendous, cruel way. So all of these animals, as wild and as evil as they might be, they do not deviate at all from God's command. And they are very aware of this, even if, let's say they're not consciously aware of it, but their spirit is aware of this. So they're very connected to God, all of these animals. And then the Alter Rebbe brings a couple of citations to support this point. The first one is from Bereshis, from Genesis chapter 9, verse 2, where it says, Morachem v'chitchem yeh al kol chayat haaretz, that the fear and dread of you shall lie upon every beast of the earth. So meaning to say that these animals have a spiritual sensitivity, and they recognize God, and they recognize our divine purpose in creation. And not only that, there's another citation here that the Alter Rebbe brings right after that, this time from the Gemara in Sanhedrin 38b, page 38b, where it says that there's no wild beast that will rule over an animal unless he sees this person as an animal. So meaning to say that animals inherently and instinctively recognize the superiority of man over them if that man is behaving like a man. But if a man behaves like an animal, then that goes away, and then the beast is it makes the person vulnerable to attack by the beast. And then the Alter Rebbe says that tzaddikim, who the image of God never leaves their face ever, all of the most wildest animals can never rule over them. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is what's explained in the Zohar about Daniel, the prophet Daniel, who he was, amongst all the lions, and he wasn't attacked by the lions because he was such a great tzaddik. So tzaddikim have such a state of holiness that they really walk around with this presence of being human. And so animals know instinctively not to attack them, not to touch them. And so thus, the Alter Rebbe says that somebody who sins and goes against the will of God, even with a very small transgression, at the time that he's doing this transgression, God forbid, then he is at an utmost distance. He's very far from the supernal holiness, which is the unity and oneness of God, more than all the other animals, even the most impure animals and the insects and the reptiles that all come from the Sitra Achra and the Klipa and from idolatry. And so now the Alter Rebbe brings up a question here, which he then answers. Is he says, okay, so if this is all true, that it's such a bad thing to go against the will of God, why do we have this clause that there's this idea that pikuach nefesh, saving a soul, saving a life, pushes aside all of the other transgressions, and we actually have this thing other than those three. There's three sins that we should choose death for, other than we should give up our lives for. Those are the sin of idolatry, the sin of adultery, and the sin of murder. So we should not do any of these things, even if it means losing our lives, God forbid. But any other thing in the Torah, a common one that often comes up is Shabbos, keeping Shabbos. If it's keep Shabbos or save a life, saving a life always, always, always takes precedence for that. And so why is this? The Alter Rebbe says, if it's such a bad thing to go against the will of God, as we learned. And he brings a citation here from the Gemara to explain this. And this comes from Shabbos, page 151b, and Yoma, page 85b, where it says that the whole idea of why it is that we should violate the Shabbos in order to save a human life is that, okay, we may be violating one Shabbos, but this is in order so that this person can keep many Shabbosim. And so the Alter Rebbe specifies this is not because of the severity or the lack of severity of the different transgressions, because he says in brackets that what you should know that Shabbos is even more severe and it weighs just as much, is just as equal to idolatry in regards to shchita. So meaning to say that there are certain people, when we talk about ritual slaughtering and having a shochet, there are certain people that we are not allowed to have as a shochet, and are not trustworthy as being a shochet. And so people like that would be somebody who is often involved with adultery and things like that. And so this applies also, somebody who violates the Shabbos would also not be considered to be trustworthy as a shochet. So this is proof to show that that Shabbos is really equal to these other laws of adultery, idolatry, all of those things. So it's not about the lack of severity in the transgression. It's just the idea that by breaking Shabbos and saving a life for that, the person will be able to keep many other Shabbosim after that. And that's just, the Alter Rebbe says that this is a decree of the scriptures, that this is how it is, that we could save a life to break Shabbos, but not to commit adultery or idolatry or murder. Okay, so this was talking about, just this idea of what is happening when a person is committing this transgression, God forbid. So at the time that a person is committing the transgression, as we mentioned, what they're doing basically is they're becoming lowlier. They are in a lower state than all of the animals and impure animals and all of this, and not only the impure animals, but the Sitra Achra and the Klipos, all of the evil forces. So it's pretty bad, right? But now the Alter Rebbe says here, but okay, after the sin, what happens after the sin? If the sin is there's different types of sins. So there are some sins which make a person liable for excommunication. So this would be sins that are liable for kares, and some other sins that make a person liable for death by the hands of heavens. And so nowadays a person might see somebody who does commit one of these sins, but they don't die immediately. So the Alter Rebbe says that this, in the case of this, it's not that the godly soul will die completely or that it will be totally uprooted from its source in God, but it's just going to be, its attachment and it's like holding in its source is going to be weakened slightly. Like there's going to be like a blemish in its attachment to its source through doing the sin. And then the Alter Rebbe here gives a side note, like a little footnote in brackets here. And he says that there's many different types of blemishes in the soul that can happen and all kinds of different sources above. So according to the source of whatever specific blemish is happening and has occurred in the soul of this person, that there is going to be a corresponding punishment and a corresponding cleansing that will happen in Gehenna through this, or it might happen in this world, the cleansing. And he says that every single sin and transgression has a very specific punishment to it. The purpose of these punishments is in order to cleanse the soul and to get rid of the dirt and get rid of the blemish that occurred through the person doing this transgression. And he says that so too, for those sins that make a person liable for death and for kares, for excommunication, not every person gets blemished in the same way. So the blemishes are really different. So the basic idea here is that our actions really do produce an effect. It's not like we just do something and nothing happens. We do, if a person, God forbid, transgresses against the will of God, it's going to have an effect on their soul and it's going to produce a blemish in their soul. And this blemish needs to be cleansed, just like physical dirt needs to be cleansed if there's something dirty on your clothing. And the cleansing that comes about through this is what we think of as quote unquote punishment, basically. And there's different types of cleansing and different types of punishments for different kinds of sins is the basic idea. So now going back to what we were talking about what happens after the person commits the sin, is that after the sin is over, it's done with, we did the sin, God forbid, then the animal soul that is enclosed within the body, and so to the person's body, return and go up from the Sitra Achra and the Klipa that they were attached to, and they return back to and become close once again to the holiness of the Nefesh Elokis, of the godly soul within which they are clothed. And this godly soul believes in one God, right? And even while the person was engaged in the sin, God forbid, then this godly soul was still there, and this godly soul still believes in God and is still held strong to its belief in God. It's just that this godly soul was exiled. It was in this state of exile within the animal soul in the Sitra Achra that was causing the body to sin and was bringing it down into the depths of Shaul, like the depths of the lowest depths, in which is lower than the impurity of the Sitra Achra and the Klipa of idolatry. And God should save us from this. And there's no greater galus, there's no greater exile than this. So the Alter Rebbe likens this as going from a lofty roof to a very, very deep pit. So the basic idea here is basically that when a person commits a sin, their animal soul and their body is involved in the sin, but the godly soul is still there within the person's body, and the godly soul still believes strongly in God. It hasn't changed. Nothing changed about it. It's just trapped, and it's in a state of exile within the body, and that's why it's not acting in the way that it would like to. And the reason why the Alter Rebbe likens it to this great fall, from this high roof into the lowest pits, is because we explained before that the source and root of the souls of all Jews is from the supernal chokhmah, the supernal wisdom. And we said, remember, that God and his chokhmah are one. And so what he likens this to, what the Alter Rebbe likens this to, is it's like a parable of basically somebody taking the head of a king and bringing it down and putting it inside a toilet that is full of excrement. So it's, it's a very intense visual, but that's what the Alter Rebbe likens it to. It's like you're taking the head of the king and putting it into a toilet. And there's nothing more humiliating than this. And even if a person does this transgression, even for a split second, it's a very humiliating thing. It's very gross. And this, why do we liken it to a toilet and excrement? Is because the klipos and the Sitra Achra are called vomit and excrement, as is known. So that is the end of the chapter. I know that was quite long, but just to really sum up really quickly, is what we learned today is basically about how human agency, especially the agency of a Jew, and what's expected of us, is that we have free will. And this is something that is unique to us and that other animals do not possess, that nothing in creation possesses. And so when we see animals behaving cruelly, or when we look at evil within the world, which is all sourced from the klipos and the sitra achra and these negative forces that we talked about, these things are not to be blamed in their own right, because these things are ultimately just doing the will of God. They are fulfilling the purpose that they were created for. And on some level, they're actually aware of that. And in that awareness, they actually are serving God. Like, they have this awareness of their vitality and their life force coming from God. Maybe that awareness is a little bit skewed somewhat in the sense that they think of themselves as having an independent existence to a certain extent, and they think they are also gods, but they do acknowledge that God exists. However, when a person goes against the will of God and a person uses their free will to go against that will of God, that makes them lower than these forces. That brings them down into this lowest pit. Why? Because we should know better, and we have agency, unlike the animals. And so we do have free will. And if we use our free will to go against our creator, this is like the biggest slap in the face to God. This is like a total slap in the face. It's like, how the Alter Rebbe likened it to going from this really high roof down into this really low pit, or to be even more vivid and visual. It's like we're taking the head of a king, God forbid, and we're putting it into a toilet that's filled with excrement. It's quite intense. And so keeping this in mind, that if we all do have this deep connection with God, and we all on some level have this awareness, and we talked about how every Jew would be willing to give up our lives, if not to renounce our Judaism, how could it be that we would ever commit a transgression? It doesn't make sense. It's like, it's kind of baffling, that we would ever go against the will of God. And the Alter Rebbe says that, yes, indeed, it is very baffling. And so we wouldn't do it rationally. And the only reason why we would is because a spirit of insanity, of temporary insanity, comes upon a person. It's a spirit of folly. And that's what leads a person to sin. Because rationally speaking, we would never go against the will of God, because it literally just does not make any sense. And it goes against everything that we stand for within our inner being as a Jew. And, to finish off with that, just kind of at the end, the Alter Rebbe brought up this point of the godly soul and the animal soul, and how it's what is getting involved in these klipos and descending and all of that is the animal soul. The godly soul remains pure at all times, and the godly soul remains steadfast and strong in its faith and belief in God. The only thing is that in the time of this transgression, it's in a state of exile, and it's trapped, and it's unable to manifest this belief in a more overt way. So I hope that was clear. I know it was a lot today, but that's it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free. I love to see comments on the YouTube channel, in the video of the YouTube. So please do that, and I will speak to you tomorrow, and we will move onwards and get into chapter 25. I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.